So, Ianon 1:1. In arche in hologos, kai in hologos in proston theon, kai theos in hologos. Ianon 1:1. In order to start to understand the opening verse of the Gospel of John, we have to first understand the language, culture, and intention of the author. So, the Greek alphabet. So, alpha, pronounced like awesome, and is one of the 7 vowels. So, the word that you saw here, arche, which means beginning. Beta, pronounced like beta. Bale, throw. Gamma, pronounced like gamma. Gain, which means land. Delta, pronounced like delta, which is doce, glory. Epsilon, pronounced like echo, another one of the 7 vowels. Isothon, zeta, pronounced like zeta. Zoe is life. Eta, pronounced like 8. Theta, pronounced like thought, thalason. Iota, pronounced like leech. So there you have Iesus, which is the Greek name for Jesus. Kappa, pronounced like kill. And you have cardia, which is heart. Lambda, pronounced like lambda. Logos, word. Ignore the capital there. Google Slides kept making me capitalize the letters when I didn't want to. Mu, pronounced like mu. That's marturian, witness, where we get martyr from. Nu, pronounced like nu, nomos, law. Xi, pronounced like axe. Xi, xera, dry. Omicron, pronounced like owl, another one of the 7 vowels, and it'd be haughty. P, everybody says pi, it's not. Pronounced like P. Parakletos, helper. Pro, you notice there's a slight pro. You roll the R a little bit, like in Rabbi. Sigma, and you'll notice 2 different letters there. The first one is when it is in any other position except for the last letter in the word. And the second one is when it is the last letter in the word. So sigma, pronounced just like an S, sigma. And that's sarkos, which is flesh. Tau, standard T sound. And then T with the accent is what? That's important. We'll get to that later. Upsilon, pronounced like usual. So it would be hypostasis. Some do pronounce it like the Y in hyper. So they would pronounce that hyperstasis. That's debated to this day. Most people you will see will use it as usual. That U sound. Or U. Phi, like in Philadelphia. And you have phos, which is light. Chi, pronounced like Christian. Christos. So together it would be Jesus Christos. Psi, like clips. So there you have psuken, which is soul. And lastly, omega, pronounced like O. The 7 vowels. There you have onomasin, called. Diphthongs. It's such a fun word to say. So we have I, pronounced like isle, and the word kai, and ing, pronounced like doing. So euangelion should be gospel. Okay, so this one's a little trickier. Now it does make a similar sound to eta, but it's a, whereas eta is just a. A. There's that slight iota in there. So when we have a word like iselthen, which is entered, there's iselthen versus iselthen, right? There's a very slight difference, but again, it's just like we were talking about. For a native speaker, they can tell you the difference right away. It just doesn't sound like it to us. Oi, pronounced like poise. Epoisen did. Ui, like sweet. Uios. That's a really fun one to say. Uiois. Sons. Ow, pronounced like ouch. Auto, him. You notice the little marking underneath the omega there. We'll talk about that later. Oo, like in soup. Jesus. And once again, we have, so for this one, you have epsilon, upsilon, and eta upsilon. Now it's pronounced like feud, so euangelion. The funny thing is, I could not actually find an example of eta and upsilon next to each other to form a diphthong. The book did not give one. No website I found could give one. The book lists it as a possible diphthong, but not sure it actually exists. So that brings us to the iota subscript, which is the thing here, this little symbol below the omega there. It does not actually impact pronunciation when it's written in the New Testament, but it did in earlier works, like the Septuagint. So that's just kind of how the language changed and developed over time. Functionally, it makes the sound longer when we're pronouncing it. So here, if we were pronouncing it the Septuagint way, this word would be atoi. However, in the New Testament, we would just pronounce it auto. So it's indicated by a very small iota underneath either an alpha, an eta, or an omega. And then it affects translation because it changes the epsilon at the end of a word to an eta, which will change the person that you're addressing because of how endings work. So an epsilon at the end of the word would normally be a neuter word, but the iota subscript will change it to a feminine word. Yeah. So it can dictate case. It can change the way that the word functions in the sentence. The iota subscript is generally something that outside of, actually, you won't really think about it while you're reading Greek. You would only have to think about it if you're learning this rule, because generally when you're reading Greek manuscript, they've already done the work to change it for you. So really it's just there to educate you on pronunciation and possibly to help you figure out what the word is like in the sentence, how it's being used. So capitals. Originally in Koine Greek, there were no capital letters. They were added later to help differentiate proper nouns, locations, etc. New Testament manuscripts will have capital letters because they came after that change happened. That change happened right around the 4th century BC. Many Septuagint manuscripts do not have capital letters because the Septuagint was translated right around that time. They hadn't incorporated that rule quite yet. And then there's all the capitals on screen. It's a little tricky because some of them look like letters that we know. Like the capital for Ro is literally just a capital P, which trips a lot of people up, especially when they're reading Greek and they see that symbol. They'll pronounce it like a P, because why wouldn't you? But in actuality, it's an R sound. Okay, syllabification and accents. This is the, in my opinion, probably most complicated stuff. Greek words rely heavily on syllables. They determine pronunciation, which determines meaning. I wrote can determine meaning there. I should have honestly just left can out. It determines meaning. So there are 7 rules to syllables. There is one vowel or, that should say or, one vowel or diphthong per syllable. So there you have a, ke, ko, men. You see there's only one letter per. And then mar, tu, pu, men. There's a diphthong there. Single consonants. So let's say the beginning of the word there for akakomen started with a consonant. That consonant would just be by itself. Or no, excuse me. Sorry, wrong way around. That vowel is just by itself. If it started with a consonant, it would go with the succeeding vowel. So let's say it started with that kappa and the alpha wasn't there. it would still be attached to that eta. So then we have akekomen there. Let's say this alpha didn't exist and the non-existent word of kekomen was what you were working with. You would still split it up like this. That kappa still goes with the eta. Consonants do not go by themselves. Consecutive vowels don't form, or that don't form a diphthong, are divided. So, for example, if you have an omicron and an eta, those would be divided. They do not form a diphthong, so you would pronounce whatever you were saying as O-A instead of like O-A or whatever diphthong you would try to create out of that monstrosity. Two consonants next to each other that cannot be pronounced are divided. So I gave the example there of martupomen. The ro and tau next to each other cannot be pronounced together because you would be pronouncing it as like rt, which is not really a sound in Greek. So you would split those up. The ro would go with the first syllable and the tau would go with the second. Consonant clusters that can be pronounced go with the succeeding vowel. So what that means is, for example, in the word there, Christos, that sigma there will go with the second because it's attached to that tau. It is a consonant cluster. Consonant clusters are two consonants in a row. It will go with that since it can be pronounced. Double consonants are divided by syllable. So then you have there euangelion, even though that's what's called a nasal gamma. We talked about that diphthong. Even though that's pronounced the same, you would still syllabify that differently. And lastly, compound words are divided where adjoined. So the word antichristos, which is of course antichrist, is divided at anti, then Christos, or Christos. Greek pronounces similar words differently based on symbols called accents above the letters, which cause differences in translation. Like I said, the way it's pronounced dictates the way that you translate it. It's a very spoken language. Only the last three syllables in any word can be accented. So the three, oh my goodness, what's the word I'm looking for? The three syllables, the last three are named antepenult, penult, and ultima. So here we have a word with four syllables. The beginning symbol, the beginning could not have any accents. That's not an accent, that's a breathing mark. We'll get to the difference later. So then what you could have accents here on the antepenult, could have an accent here on the penult, and here on the ultima. So there are three different types of accents. The acute can go on any of the three. The grave can only be placed on the ultima. And the circumflex can only be placed on either the penult or the ultima. The acute indicates a raising tone. I find it to be helpful because it looks like it's raising. Usually that is indicated as a question. The grave indicates down in tone. You go down to a grave. It also goes down. And then the circumflex looks like that. And people theorize it looks like that because it indicated it going up and then down in tone. I should say the circumflex also always indicates a long pronunciation of a word, or not a word, of a letter. And then we also have a similar word here. I guess I could just point to the screen. I have not been doing that this whole time. So we have a similar word here, skene, versus skeneis. You hear the difference there? Skene, skeneis. Right, so that the accent there, when it's an acute, it just means tent. Skeneis changes it to, I believe it's genitive, which is of a tent. Cases and endings. So that's the nominative case. That is the subject of a sentence. So I gave the example there. I am the owner of the Greek book you have, where the subject is I. Endings. This is the bane of every Greek student's existence. It is called an ending table. Nobody likes them, but they exist anyways. Endings for masculine singular is an omicron followed by a sigma. So when you see the word logos, you know that is masculine singular nominative. Feminine singular is either an eta or an alpha. That would be in a word like hora. Neuter singular ending is an omicron and a nu, on. So lexical forms of words, which is like the base form, will always appear nominative singular. So the lexical form of the word logos is logos. So anytime you see like lagon and it says, hey, put this into its lexical form, you just nominative singular. Masculine and feminine plural, I can't even speak English, are just iotas. And then lastly, neutral plural is just an alpha. So it does get a little confusing there because you might have a nominative word ending in an alpha, and you then have to figure out, is it feminine singular or nominative plural? Generally, you can figure that out through context, and it's not that tough. Then we have the articles. Each case has its own set of articles, of its definite articles, I should say, which is the. So every case has its own the, and in that case, they are gendered with different forms. Okay, so now that I've finished this wonderful little endeavor, these are the nominative definite articles. So whenever you see these words, you have all of these. Feel free to just take a picture of the board when I'm done. That'd probably be easier. I gave an example there. Idakrusen ho Jesus. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. We have here the accusative. So in the example, I am the owner of the Greek book you have. The accusative is the direct object of the sentence. In other words, what you're talking about, what the action is being performed on. So as I said in that example, Greek book is the subject. And then, I didn't mention this before, the nominative articles will always appear before the subject. For example, ho logos. That is your nominative article, therefore it will always appear before the subject, in that case, logos. The accusative article always appears directly before the object, which you can see in the example there. Kai eseothen palin ais tein synagogen. You see that the feminine singular tein article, definite article, is right before the synagogon. Anyways, brain farts aside, genitive. Used in the case of possession. There is no apostrophe S in Greek, like how we would say, the horseshoe is currently Josh's. That apostrophe S does not exist. Instead, there's an entire case dedicated to it. Very similar endings in the fact that every single ending for plural and genitive is a nu, regardless of what the word is. And then for the masculine and neuter singular, it's just an upsilon. And then for the feminine singular, it is just a sigma on the end of it. There must be a circumflex on the ultima symbol of a genitive word. Circumflex to review is that one. So if you see that on the ultima, chances are you're dealing with a genitive word. The genitive articles are actually pretty easy, all things considered. They're pretty unique. If you see tu, which is tau, omicron, upsilon, you know for sure you're dealing with a genitive word. Like some of these, it can get a little confusing, right? Like nominative and accusative, neuter, plural had the same word, or had the same definite article. Genitive is pretty distinct. I find it to be the easiest case to learn. Then we have feminine singular is te. And then all of the plurals, just like with the plurals in the endings, are the same. So it's all just toe. So this is Romans 7:24. Who will rescue me from this body of death? And the exact one would be, who will me rescue from out of the death of body? Well, actually, just death. I didn't include of body, but it goes on to say of body. Last one, dative. Dative is used for the passive voice and the indirect object. So in the example, I am the owner of the Greek book you have. You is in the dative case there, because while you are an object in the sentence, it's not actually addressed to you. So let's say, Josh, you were saying this to me about my Bill Mounts book here. Yes, you are addressing me, but you're actually focused on the book in the sentence. So it's really, dative words are used to kind of help clarify the positioning in a sentence. And they're very easy to memorize the endings, because it's literally just a bunch of iotas, and then the plural is all iota sigma. And this also must have the ultima on, or the circumflex and the ultima symbol. Dative words are kind of rare, but they're common enough to where you need to know the case. Most of the time when you see a circumflex, it's going to be a genitive word. And lastly, the articles. So this one is always before the indirect object, which is you. I didn't mention it previously, but I'll go back and do it now. For the genitive articles, it's dependent on the word that it's possessive of, where exactly you'll find it. So sometimes you will find a genitive article not attached to the actual word it's the article of, which is weird. But I should have chosen an example where that was the case. However, you see tooth on a two of death. It's still attached there, but generally you will see you might see some examples where it's not attached. It's not common, but it happens. For the dative, it's always before that indirect object. So it would always be before the you in the example that I gave. And dative articles are also pretty distinct. Not quite the same as genitive, but close. They often look like the articles of other cases, but missing a letter. Like you have for the female singular there, you have te versus in the accusative it's tain. It looks similar, but not quite the same. So that, it is the end of cases. Punctuation. So the original manuscripts have no punctuation. It's added later in by copyists to help kind of break up sentences, distinguish ideas, help us understand what they're actually saying instead of just guessing. Most punctuation is similar to today in that a period is a period, a comma is a comma, but where it gets a little funky is you will have a large dot, which is a colon, and then what we normally call a semicolon is a question mark. Breathing marks. So breathing marks are apostrophe-like symbols which dictate pronunciation. Those are your breathing marks. That's it. If the breathing mark is like this, then it is smooth breathing and it is unpronounced. If it has this, it is rough breathing and is pronounced. Breathing marks apply to vowels, diphthongs, and ro. Ro will always have a rough breathing mark, as will upsilon. Breathing marks go at the beginning of words. You will never find a breathing mark past the first two letters. Generally, it's always on the first one, but if you have a diphthong, it will appear on the second letter. I will say, so while it's only one slide, breathing marks are extremely important. They dictate, as I said, pronunciation, and pronunciation dictates meaning. You will have words, I should have chosen an example of one, where the breathing mark changes how you translate it and how you understand it. Anyway, so very important. Happy, clappy, heresy. We're going to kind of get into the actual meat of John 1 now, the thing that kicked this all off. So we have there, kai theos ein hologos. This is one of the go-to passages of Christians to quickly and easily identify Jesus as God. So for groups like Jehovah's Witness or even Mormons, who state that Jesus is either not the same God as the Father or is a lesser God, they will argue that since there is no definite article attached to theos, it should be translated as a God. So a God was the word, versus what we have, which is and the word was God. Greek, as I said, has no indefinite article. There is no a in there. Like if you were to say, I have a book, that a does not exist in Greek. It would just be, I have book. They usually just leave an article off of it, and the indefinite article is then assumed. So they will take that and say, well, then clearly, see, there's no definite article. We just have to assume the indefinite is present. But this is not the case when two subjects are equated by the verb to be, which is eimi. One subject becomes the predicate nominative. So the predicate nominative happens, as I said, when two nouns in the nominative case. You'll see that theos and logos are both in the nominative. They're both ending with omicron sigma, meaning they are either, but in this case they are both, masculine singular nominative. If they are equated with eimi or any of its forms, you get the predicate nominative. The word ein there is the word was. So kai theos ein hologos is and God was the word. Even though theos does not have an article, the article is implied since it is equated to something, to another nominative that does have the definite article. So here's the exact transliteration. So we have en, in, arche, the beginning. And see, there you have another example of the predicate nominative. Arche is feminine nominative singular. And you have was the word. So the beginning and the word, both nominative, both in the same sentence. Now some Jehovah's Witnesses have taken their understanding of the last fragment and applied it here and say, well, it's in a beginning, right? It doesn't mean that Jesus always was, but that he was created in a beginning. However, again, we have here the predicate nominative. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with, present before, the God, and God was the Word. It's the exact translation of it. So the reason I provided the interlinear is it shows exactly how the ancient readers would have understood this passage. They would not have understood it as in a beginning or a God was the Word. They would have looked at that and said, okay, those are being equated with something that has the definite article. They're two nominatives. They are the same in that sense. Therefore, I can assume predicate nominative, definite article. But as I asked, why doesn't John just include the definite article? So because you have two words in the nominative, you have theos and logos. They are both in the nominative case. They are two subjects in the same sentence. They are both performing an action, in other words. And then because you have a version of the word to be, being was, that then equates them. Because it's essentially saying God is Word. That's past tense. So God was Word. They are the same. They are of the same substance in the author's mind. So then, given that they are the same substance, or at least of the same case, since you have a definite article on this word, it is assumed that this definite article also applies here, without it being written. John was very intentional with this word choice. Very intentional with how he wrote this. He uses the PN to avoid indefinite article, so it can't be a God, showing that Jesus is God just as the Father is God. But he does not use the definite article for theos to avoid Sabellianism, which is a heresy that says that the Son literally is the Father, both in substance and in person. Because if John were to put the definitive article there, which would be ha, same one, you would get the God is the Word. It would have meant that God the Father had come down as the Word, which is not the case, and that's heresy. So John was very, very careful with, I'm going to get the heresy off the board. John was very, very careful with how he wrote that sentence, because he knew that this is such a critical statement which could be taken and misinterpreted. Sabellianism arises in the 1st century. Given when John is writing, even if you take the most conservative of estimates, which would be around 70s, Sabellianism would have been around. He would have known about it. So he does not use the definite article to avoid Sabellianism. He does use the predicate nominative to avoid any confusion with possible paganism. Especially that's very important given the Roman culture they lived in. So John successfully, by choosing this specific word order for this fragment, makes a distinction in person while identifying homoousios, same substance. He also uses a little bit of Genesis 1 language in there. So right there we have the opening phrase to Genesis 1 in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament done in the 4th century BC. The Jews quickly realized that Greek was going to be the language of the times, so they retranslated the Torah mostly, but then later on would translate the Tanakh as well, which is the rest of our Old Testament, into Greek. En arche epoiesin ho theos. In the beginning made the God. Yeah. Kind of funny to hear it in English because it sounds a little...
sounds like something made God.
Yeah, exactly. But that would be the direct word for word translation into English without restructuring for how English grammar works. So John uses very similar language with the focus of God and the beginning. Right? So he's appealing back to that same beginning in John 1:1 as in Genesis 1:1. So it's another method he uses to equate the word with God, because he will then go on to say in the subsequent verses about, actually I think I might be getting ahead of myself, I might have included this, so we'll hold off on that thought actually. But then we also have the Septuagint language of Proverbs, in verse 3 of John, which is what I'm kind of talking about there. So you have kurios ektise me arkein odon atu eis erga atu, which is Proverbs 8:22 in the Septuagint. So that is wisdom talking about being with the Lord as he laid the foundations of the earth in the beginning. So then it uses extremely similar language for wisdom as it does for the word, as John does for the word in John 1:3. You see the same sort of language in Proverbs 8. So that establishes the word as maker of all things and pre-existent to all of creation. Right? And so this is actually a very, very helpful polemic for Mormons, because if you want to, and a little bit Jehovah's Witness, I'd have to look at how the New World Translation actually translates it, because they will only learn from the New World Translation. You can't show them like an ESV. They won't accept it. So I'd have to look at how that does it. But for Mormons, they will accept other Bible translations outside of the Joseph Smith translation. And this is a very helpful passage, because you can say, is there ever a time when God was not wise? Well, no. Okay, so then God always has wisdom even before the world began, even before everything was created. Yes. Okay, great. Now let's go to John 1. And you show him verse 3, and you show him Proverbs 8, where wisdom is talked about in the same language as the word. And you can't deny it at that point. You've already agreed that, yes, God was always wise. This wisdom, this personification of wisdom, was always existent. Well, John says that personification of wisdom is Jesus. So now you can't deny that. You can't say that Jesus is just another created being, which is the Mormon claim. So essentially, that claim, or this structure by John 2,000 years ago, disproves a heresy today. So we arrive at John 1:14. Halogos saurs egeneto kai eskenosen en hemin kai ethea sametha. Not a fun word to say. Ten dotsan autu dotsan os hos monogeneus para patros pleres caritos kai aletheas. The Word was made flesh and dwelt with us. We beheld the glory of him. The glory is begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Clearly talking about Jesus. He is undeniably God incarnate. Because of what we talked about here in John 1:1, it is very clear then that this same Word, which, mind you, God was the Word, is incarnate here. And he is the only begotten from the Father. So what exactly is the Word? We know it's the second person of the Trinity, but what did that mean to the ancient Greeks? First formulated by Socrates, who errantly believed that the daimonion was responsible for wisdom, which is spiritual forces particularly not of the best nature. Demons. Evil spirits. He believed that they provided him wisdom, which is a little sketch, to say the least. So his student, right? Plato was his student, and then Plato taught Aristotle, took the underlying spiritual aspect and attributed it instead to one God as the source for all things, both material and immaterial. However, he had more of a deist outlook. John takes this thought, which actually a class on Aristotle would be a lot of fun, but John takes this thought, it's now been passed down for about 300 years, and says, you guys almost got it right, but this word, this divine reason, as Aristotle calls it, and it later goes on to become the word. I forget which philosopher actually coined it as the word. But John says that's not only just some divine reason, some divine force out there, it's an actual person. And he is the Christ. He incarnates for us. He does intervene. He meshes it with Genesis 1 and puts Yahweh over the common thought, just as Moses did for the gods of his time. As you talk about, he takes shots at the other gods in the Torah, and specifically in the creation story. John says, all your philosophies, all your thoughts, all your ideas, they are all underneath the Word, whom is God in the flesh.